So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our 6th webinar in our summer series. And even though summer is pretty much over, it's September already, we're still going to have one more after this, but this one is titled The Deaf Community. MTM is very pleased to host this webinar series, and I'm happy to introduce our presenters, Brittany Hoff, who's a travel trainer with our WMATA program in Washington, D.C., and Holly Rue, Master of Social Work. She's coordinator of Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services at the Greater Nashua Mental Health Center. Please keep in mind, if you have any questions for presenters, please use the chat feature you can see in the right-hand corner, or you can also use the Q&A button. Please direct all questions to me, Nathan Grace, that's Nathan, N-A-T-H-A-N, Grace. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be available on the MTM website after, usually about a week afterwards. If you need any accessible versions of this information, of the webinar slides, please let us know. You can email me at N for Nathan, Grace, G-R-A-E-F-F as in Frank, at mtm-inc.net. Please also keep in mind this webinar will be utilizing an ASL/English interpreter off camera, so please be aware that there may be some gaps to allow for additional communication. All right, so now I'd like to turn this webinar over to Holly.
Hello. I'm happy to be here today, and thank you for inviting me. So really, I want to discuss who is part of the deaf community. Really, people who, A, could have a hearing loss, or perhaps they're deaf, hard of hearing, and these are people who use sign language for communication. Sometimes they can communicate by speaking themselves, relying on hearing aids, lip reading, but what is important is the unity of the community. And they also use American Sign Language. So the purpose of this webinar also is to explain the ASL portion of it and hard of hearing when we're thinking of senior citizens and late in deaf and adults. So people who are culturally deaf, that means that they have fluency in American Sign Language, they are part of the deaf culture, they identify themselves as being deaf. And also when we're speaking of dual diagnosis, that means someone who is deaf and may have some kind of mental health issue along with that. So really our population is at high risk for mental health issues because we're a minority group, for one, we're oppressed, for two. So that means there's more stress just in general being a minority, anxiety, depression, and also there is an equal risk for organic mental health issues such as schizophrenia, bipolar. Those are just some examples of what I mean by organic. Next slide, please. Statistically, you will see that 2 or 3 out of 1,000 people in the population are born with a hearing loss. So either one or both. So now, today it's more common, you may see some cochlear implants, and that is more common in our population now. Before, historically, it was rare, and then as toddlers came into their adulthood or teenage years, they made the decision for themselves. But now it seems more popular that during infancy, parents are making the decision. So you will see that more often. Next slide, please. Britt?
I've covered a few of the statistics. Hearing loss, as you can see on the next slide, of 35 decibels or more in your better ear, hearing aids may be beneficial. That doesn't mean that everybody would use hearing aids. That is a personal choice. A lot of the older adults that we work with are experiencing hearing loss for the first time in their life. they're having a difficult time sometimes accepting this and learning how to adapt to their environment. And sometimes for some individuals, hearing aids are not affordable for them and it's not an option. So they need to figure out how to adapt to the situation around them. And us as travel trainers need to be aware of that when it comes to communication and also being out in the community with them. You can see the statistics that also about 8.5% of adults that are 55 to 64 years of age, they are experiencing hearing loss. And as the age goes on, you can see that those percentages increase. Next slide. Oh, Holly just wanted to add something.
I wanted to add that also 9 out of 10 deaf infants are born into hearing families. So that means that, you know, if you're a first-time parent, this may be the first time you're being exposed to deafness, hearing loss, deaf culture. So most of the time, parents are not making well-informed decisions, not always. They could be influenced by the medical association as to the medical perspective on deafness, which more often than not is a cochlear implant. Wanted to let you know that that's a high number. 9 out of 10 deaf children are born to hearing parents. Britt?
All right. And a lot of people wonder, when is the best time to use an ASL English interpreter? We as travel trainers aren't really sure. If we get a referral, whether it's from our agency or from somebody in the community, and we have the note that they're deaf or hard of hearing, a lot of us may not know if we need an interpreter or not. If you're already asking yourself that question, that's good. You realize that there is a need for an interpreter at some times. Anytime, as you can see the 4 points listed in the slide, anytime the individual requests an interpreter, you must provide one. If you're signing any kind of papers, consent forms, anything that would be like an assessment or anything like that, and the individual has to sign it, it's best practice to have an interpreter there, especially if the individual's primary language is not English. Anytime you're completing assessments, this is most important because as you're completing your assessment, that's most of the time your first meeting point, and you're asking lots of questions. This best practice allows for higher quality of training down the road when you go into your travel training sessions. And you're also able to get a full picture of what's going on with the individual, and you can eliminate any of the gray areas. If there's miscommunication, a lot of that can be eliminated, especially if the individual is not sure about what travel training may be and you're having a hard time explaining it. And lastly, for travel training sessions, depending upon how long the sessions may be, how many weeks they may go on, it's always best practice to have an interpreter. It's not the deaf person's interpreter, it's both of your interpreters. That's a very important point. The deaf person is not responsible for providing their own interpreter. Following these best practices also keeps a good reputation for yourself, whether you work for a transit agency or a nonprofit or whoever you're working for. You can keep a good reputation within the deaf community. So if others do want travel training, they know that you are aware that interpreters are needed. Next slide.
I wanted to add, when you are providing communication, it is important to provide qualified access to that communication. So it's always good when that communication is happening, you have more trust within the agency from the deaf community. So if it's good communication access, then there will be more trust throughout the community with your agency. So that's just a note I wanted to add to that slide. Next slide, please. Oh, perfect. Thank you. So question 1 is, when working with an individual who themselves are deaf and hard of hearing, what is the proper terminology to remain respectful? Really, the top rule I would say is ask the client themselves. Ask them how they prefer to be referred to, what their identity is. Try to elicit that information from them. It's okay to ask. You know, do you think of yourself as deaf, hard of hearing? It's okay to ask. There's nothing wrong with that. And they may not use, some people think a word may be PC, but it is in fact not hearing impaired. That is a medical term and used in the medical field, and it is a medical perspective on hearing loss. And it implies that there's something that needs to be fixed. So really, I would stay away from that particular term, hearing impaired, if possible. And you will also find that most people who sign, who use American Sign Language, they will refer to themselves as deaf. Also, some people who speak for themselves, who are late deafened, maybe they don't have ASL fluency, they tend to label themselves as hard of hearing. But I think the biggest priority is to ask themselves. Next slide. So question 2 is, what are the perceived barriers to individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing related to the transportation community or setting? Really, I can speak from personal experience, obviously. Announcements. You know how you have announcements on the buses or trains of the next stop? For example, if a bus driver announces, we are now at such and such a street, this is the stop, I have no access to that information. So that's one reason. Also, maybe if you're using a cab and you're sitting in the back, obviously, and the cab driver's in the front, that is not great accessibility to communication. But I think the biggest barrier that I see most often I'd have to refer back to is the announcements. You know, at the train station, on the bus itself, cab drivers, any of those, and I'm seeing that more and more often. Britt, did you want to add anything to that with your experience?
Specifically here in DC, some of the barriers that we have on public transportation, to go along with Holly's points on the announcements, some of our metro stations can be very dark. They're working on improving that right now, but if you're working with somebody, obviously being able to see is very important for them, and especially if the person may have lower vision, you need to be aware of which stops or what time of day you're working at. If it's late in the evening and you're at a dark bus stop, you have to be aware of street lights, where you're going to wait, and that comes into play with safety as well.
Next slide, please.
So what are some tips, tricks, or tools you find helpful when working with an individual who is deaf or hard of hearing within the community setting and on public transportation? Personally, when I'm out training somebody that is deaf or hard of hearing, my entire training is based on visual. Everything is visual. I'm using maps, I'm using pictures. I completely avoid any written direction unless it's a couple of words here or there. And the words are usually proper nouns after stop names or street names so that they can identify them. If the individual has access to a phone or a smartphone specifically, I'll have them take pictures along their route. They can go back and use this and look, and it's a reminder to help them as they're learning their route. As if they don't have a smartphone or are not able to take pictures, I'll do it myself and then make little booklets for them so that they can carry this with them if they're having a hard time recognizing a specific intersection or a specific transfer point. But everything, again, is visual. Specifically, sitting in a vehicle on buses, you want to be aware that sometimes sitting up right behind the vehicle operator is really tricky. It eliminates being able to view the very front of the bus and what direction the bus is going. You want them to have a clear view, if possible, of all sides of the window, to the left, to the right, and forward. In DC here, our buses, a lot of them have steps up in the back, which are really helpful because it gives you a vantage point that's a little bit higher up, and you can see above the people that are sitting below you. This works great for being able to see and spot different stops or different landmarks along the way. I think the biggest tip is to be patient and to, with any client that we work with, is just to remain patient, especially if you are using an interpreter, because you want to allow for the extra time. Keep a smile on your face and just know that this is an experience for everybody involved. On trains, if you can sit across from one another, that may be helpful, specifically making sure that the client and the interpreter have preference of where they sit and where it's most comfortable for them, especially so that the individual can have access to the interpreter, especially if they're working on, if it's the first time out and they're really in unfamiliar area, they're really nervous, they're really anxious. You want to make sure that their access to communication is right there. And Holly, would you like to add anything for in the community setting?
Yes. I work here in New Hampshire, and really it's a more rural state. I mean, we do have Boston, and I have experienced Boston and DC, but I would recommend that, you know, the client needs to recognize where they're going for informational purposes. So show them where the map is, where they can find information. Show them like the sign themselves, like this is where this street sign is, or where information is located. So I do encourage the deaf person to communicate with the bus driver or with the staff person who may be working there at the station. Go ahead and ask them questions. There's nothing wrong with that. But realize that sometimes deaf and hard of hearing people are not comfortable approaching hearing people, not always. They may not have the skills yet, or they may have mental health issues, they may have other disabilities. So it's not always to communicate with the hearing individual. So maybe if you can help coach how to ask for help, how to ask for more information if that's needed, how to access that information out in the community. Next slide.
All right, question 4. What are some safety concerns to be aware of when working with an individual who is deaf or hard of hearing within the community and on public transportation? I briefly just touched on safety, and as travel trainers, safety is our top concern. We want to make sure whoever we're working with that they're going to be safe, especially as they take their first steps towards riding independently, sometimes for the very first time in their life. They're just as vulnerable, if not sometimes more, depending upon their situation. I stress and teach the individual, empower them to be alert and focused the whole time. Be aware of where you're at. If they can, check in with somebody before they leave, in the middle of their trip. If they're just getting on or off a bus, see if they can text somebody along their route just to check in. And sometimes I offer myself, even if I'm completed training with them, I offer myself just as a check-in. If they're going out in 2 weeks and I know they're going downtown to meet a friend, I have them text me along the way if that makes them feel a bit more safe and a bit more comfortable as they kind of learn and develop their skills of being more independent. I stress stranger danger as I would with anybody. And also, if it's possible, traveling with a buddy, if they're able to show and demonstrate that they're safe and they're well-versed on their new route or a route that is familiar with them, that go ahead and bring a buddy with, and maybe teaching that friend or that buddy some tips will help empower them to feel more confident. Safety, I touched on earlier with being aware of the time of day or the lighting of the situation. Here in DC, we occasionally have power outages in our metro system, which will cause stations to go completely black, which can be a very, very scary situation. We also have train cars that can go black, and making sure that I teach this of what to do if this happens, making sure that they know where they can go to access help, who's the friendly and the safe person to contact, if it's going to be a station manager, a metro employee, the bus operator, and whether or not they're comfortable approaching that person, and if they are, what they can do. Now, if they're not comfortable approaching this person, then we talk about backup plans and what is comfortable for them. What can they do? Is that a text message to a family member? Is that stopping in 2 blocks down from their route where they know a friend lives and they'd be able to seek some safety? Also being aware that if something like that would happen, whether a power outage or anything else, helping them find space where they can calm down, especially individuals that are experiencing different mental illness, where they may have panic attack or get incredibly anxious, making sure that they know along the way where's safe refuge where they can just take a breath, step aside, and take time until they're ready to step back on that bus or back on that train. This goes into play for a lot of the route planning. If individuals are, if we're planning a route for them, and we want to make sure that the route is the safest, that also might include where is that bus traveling, what neighborhood is that bus traveling through? Is their bus stop right outside a liquor store and they're working on, and they have addiction issues? Probably not the best route and the best bus stop. So I think what would be best is maybe taking the bus that might be maybe a little bit longer, 10 minutes longer, to avoid that temptation or avoid another safety concern. Sometimes in the past, what I've done is create communication cards for individuals. Sometimes this is helpful, sometimes it's not, but I always ask the individual if they're okay with this. The communication cards can be as simple as, I need help, can you please call this person and tell them to pick me up here, and leave an address. Not a personal address, but a public address, like, can you please pick me up at the Walgreens on the corner of 5th Street, so that somebody can access them and help, whether it's a staff person, a family member, or a friend. Now, not everybody is comfortable using communication cards. That's why I strongly urge you to ask the individuals before you make one or create one yourself. Next slide. Oh, and next, Holly, do you have anything to add for question 4?
No, I think you covered it.
Question 4, do you have a specific example of a situation involving an individual who is deaf or hard of hearing that did not go as expected? How did you handle the situation? What would you do differently or suggest others to do? A couple of years ago, I was working with an individual who very much operated on what we call deaf time. And Holly, if I could have you actually explain this, because I don't know how is best to explain it.
Deaf time. Okay. Really, we have deaf standard time. It's our own time zone sometimes. because really we value sign language. We value in-person communication. So when we have the opportunity to actually communicate one-on-one with someone who uses our language, we tend to go on a little bit, and it could be extended conversation, and we honestly forget time. So that's really what we call Deaf Standard Time. Also, to add to the time is saying hi to each other. You say, oh, at 2 o'clock I have to go. So then, you know, you may start saying your goodbyes. When am I going to see you again? It's an extended process to actually just say goodbye. So for the purposes of training and travel training, for example, bus schedules and train schedules, they often can be missed. So that's something culturally. We value communication with other deaf people and other people that can use our language. And sometimes that happens. We miss things.
Perfect explanation. As I was working with the individual a couple of years ago, all of her roommates were deaf, so they very much operated on deaf time. After working with her for 2 sessions, she continued to miss our meeting time. So I just set the time to say, let's meet at 1:30, even though I knew we were supposed to be meeting at 2 o'clock. This extra time allowed her to just make it on time to meet me, but it also allowed a few minutes for us to review our training ahead of time. As with anything, allow extra time so that you can make sure that you're not rushing into the training, making sure that everyone is ready, is calm and collected before they set foot on the bus or train, or even just walking down the street to the bus stop. Be aware that there'll also need to be extra time if you are using an interpreter, so that communication can go back and forth. This does need extra time. And obviously at the end, if you're wrapping up a training session, you want to make sure that you don't miss any details and that the person is prepared for the next time you meet, or if you're doing any check-ins or anything after that session. Let's see, next slide. These are some additional resources we encourage you to check out. I would specifically look to your local community. If you are working with anyone that is deaf, please don't be afraid to check out your local NAD chapter or any deaf centers or agencies. They are going to be probably the most helpful for you. And don't be afraid to walk in or email or just pick up the phone and call. And they usually encourage hearing individuals to seek out information. It makes them feel good that there are other people in the community trying to reach out and learn and be more aware. Just the additional resources, state schools for the deaf, independent living centers, colleges and universities sometimes have mentorship programs where they're working with the deaf community. And online, if you're interested in ASL or deaf culture, there's a plethora of information out there. Holly, would you like to add anything?
No, just also, you know, I am a reference. If you have any questions about deafness and mental health, if something's not clear, you're not sure if it's maybe a deaf issue or a mental health issue, you know, feel free to email me with any questions that you may have.
Great. Thank you, ladies, for your presentation. There is one question that was posed, so I want to get to that real quick if we can. I know it's 2:30. One person did ask, what are some ways for bus drivers or bus operators to alert passengers who are deaf or hard of hearing versus the actual auditory announcements?
Britt?
I guess I've seen, when I've been out in the community working, not necessarily an individual I've trained or worked with, I've seen with individuals with with low vision or blind, where when they board the bus, they ask the driver, the operator, to please let them know when they reach such and such a stop. And then they sit in the very first spot so that the operator can, in close range, let them know. For a deaf or hard of hearing individual, it might be as simple as just waving to them and motioning to them that, hey, this is your stop, pointing out to the street so they can see a street sign, but just flagging them down in a respectful way so that they can grab their attention visually. This should do the trick as long as the individual is paying attention, but most likely I would say that sitting up near the operator would be helpful if they are looking for the operator to specifically help them.
Perfect, thank you. All right, so we are running over just a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and end this early. But if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask, they can go ahead and forward those on to me. I will be more than happy to send them out to Holly and Brittany. Again, my email is N for Nathan, Grace, Graeff, 2 F's like Frank, at mtm-inc.net. So we'd love to thank you for your participation today. We also hope that you can continue to join us for our next webinar. We have one more left in our summer series. That's on Wednesday, September 23rd. It's on chronic medical conditions. So if you haven't already, please register online, the mtm-inc.net website. We would especially like to say a huge thank you to Holly and Brittany for their time today and presenting, and for the knowledge and experience. So thanks again, everybody, and have a great day.